The sun had barely risen, but Lena was already awake. Her small apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of the heater and the distant sounds of morning traffic outside. She moved slowly, careful not to wake her elderly neighbor in the next room. Today was different from every other day. Today, she was going to the audition that could change everything. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and excitement, yet there was a calm determination beneath it all. She had worked for years toward this moment, and despite the odds, she was ready to face it. Lena had always been considered ordinary by those around her. She was not flashy or glamorous, and she dressed in plain, practical clothes. Most people in her life assumed she had no big dreams, no talents that would ever take her far. But those who had seen her play the piano at home knew differently. Behind her modest apartment door, she created music that could stop a room and make hearts ache with emotion. She had learned by listening, practicing late into the night after work, and imitating recordings of great pianists she could only dream of meeting. Today, she would bring all of that into a world that had never taken her seriously. The bus ride to the audition hall was long, but Lena didn't mind. She looked out the window at the streets waking up, at the shopkeepers arranging their displays, at the children hurrying to school. She imagined each note she would play today as a conversation with all of them, a way to show the world that quiet people could have loud voices too. She clutched her music folder tightly, the worn edges a silent testimony to the countless hours she had spent practicing. Each crease was like a scar, proof of her dedication. When she arrived at the audition hall, she felt a flicker of nervousness. The building was grand and imposing, with tall glass windows and polished floors that reflected her cautious steps. Inside, the waiting area was already bustling with contestants. Many were young, their clothes stylish and expensive, their confidence almost tangible. They whispered among themselves in a language Lena didn't always understand. Words like prestige, elite, and conservatory floated in the air. They glanced at her quickly, some raising eyebrows in subtle amusement, others not bothering to look at her at all. Lena took a deep breath and found a quiet corner to sit. She tried to calm her nerves, reminding herself why she had come. She was not there to impress anyone with appearances. She was there to honor her own love for music, and more importantly, the memory of her father. He had been the one to discover her talent, encouraging her to play even when money was tight and time was scarce. Her father had always believed in her, and she carried that belief in her heart like a shield against the judgmental stares of others. As she waited, Lena overheard snippets of conversations from other contestants. One boy, who looked barely 20, was boasting about having studied with a famous piano teacher in Europe. Another girl was showing off her expensive sheet music collection, bragging about how she had started playing at the age of 4. Lena quietly smiled to herself, thinking of her own journey, self-taught, piecing together skills from books and recordings, learning through trial and error. She didn't feel inferior. She felt a quiet pride. She knew her music was born from struggle and passion, not privilege. The tension in the room was palpable. Contestants tuned their instruments, practiced scales, and whispered nervously. A few glanced at Lena again, their expressions a mix of curiosity and barely concealed mockery. One of them leaned over to another and whispered something about how that simple lady probably didn't even know how to read music properly. Lena caught the words, but chose to ignore them. She had faced doubt her entire life. Today was no different. She focused instead on steadying her breathing, imagining her fingers moving effortlessly over the piano keys, feeling the music before it even touched the air. A staff member walked through the room, calling names and checking documents. Lena watched as each contestant stepped forward, their confidence radiating, their smiles polished and practiced. When the staff glanced at her, there was a flicker of surprise. They hesitated, scanning her application with curiosity, perhaps even doubt. Lena offered a polite nod, not needing anyone's approval. She had come too far to be shaken by a single look. Time seemed to stretch and compress all at once. Moments of waiting felt eternal, yet in her mind, Lena's hands were already dancing over the keys. She remembered late nights at home, playing in the dark so as not to disturb her neighbors. She remembered the joy and frustration, the tiny victories and mistakes that taught her more than any formal lesson could. Each memory was a note in her own symphony, a reminder that she had earned this moment. Around her, contestants continued to prepare. Some practiced scales with exaggerated gestures, clearly trying to intimidate others. Some whispered strategies about impressing the judges, discussing which pieces would show technical skill versus emotional depth. Lena didn't participate. She had no need to strategize. Her music was honest, and she trusted it to speak for her. Finally, a quiet announcement came. The next auditionee was to step forward. Lena's name was called. Her stomach twisted in anticipation, but she rose calmly, holding her music folder close. The whispers stopped abruptly as everyone turned to watch her. A few contestants smirked, expecting some awkward performance that would confirm their assumptions. Lena felt the weight of their eyes, but refused to let it shake her. She walked steadily toward the piano, each step measured, each breath a quiet act of courage. When she reached the stage, Lena paused for a moment, surveying the grand piano before her. It gleamed under the lights, a powerful instrument that demanded respect. She adjusted the bench carefully, checking its height and stability, then sat down. The music folder rested gently on the stand. Lena took another deep breath, closing her eyes for a brief second. She imagined her father sitting beside her, smiling proudly, nodding for her to begin. That memory gave her strength, grounding her in the reality that this was her moment, regardless of the judgments surrounding her. The room was silent now, expectant, waiting for the first notes. Lena's hands hovered above the keys. A few contestants rolled their eyes, some judges exchanged skeptical glances, and a faint murmur of amusement passed through the waiting area. They expected clumsiness, a timid performance that would be forgotten as soon as it ended. Lena ignored them all. She was not performing for their approval. She was performing for herself, for her father, and for the music that had been her companion through countless lonely nights. As her fingers touched the keys, a hush fell over the hall. The first notes were soft, delicate, yet precise, filling the space with a gentle warmth that made some listeners lean forward unconsciously. Lena let the music flow naturally, each phrase emerging from years of practice and deep emotion. Her posture was simple, her movements not showy, but the music spoke more loudly than any gesture could. The irony was not lost on the mocking contestants. They were already starting to realize that appearances could be deceiving. Lena's mind was clear, her focus absolute. She played as if telling a story only she could fully understand, yet the audience could feel the emotions without even knowing the narrative. Every chord, every pause, every crescendo was intentional, born from her heart. For the first time in years, Lena felt completely free. The outside world, the whispers, the doubts, all of it melted away. There was only her and the music. As she finished the first piece, a quiet, unexpected murmur ran through the room. Judges looked up, some exchanging glances of surprise. Lena opened her eyes, noticing a slight change in the atmosphere. It was subtle, but it was there. People who had doubted her, laughed at her, or assumed she was unworthy were no longer smirking. Some faces were blank, almost frozen in realization. Lena felt a quiet satisfaction, not from proving anyone wrong, but from experiencing the pure, honest connection that music had given her. She gathered her folder, preparing for the next piece. Lena knew this was just the beginning of the audition, but she also knew that the first impression had shifted. The mocking looks had faded, replaced by curiosity, attention, and in some cases, awe. For Lena, the most important part was not their approval. It was the confirmation that her passion, her dedication, and her love for music were real and undeniable. As the next contestant was called, Lena sat back for a brief moment, letting the music linger in the room like a gentle echo. She could feel the change in energy around her. The mocking whispers had been replaced by a tense silence, a mixture of surprise and newfound respect. Lena smiled quietly to herself. She didn't need to shout or boast. Her music had already spoken. The sun outside continued its slow rise, spilling light across the city streets, illuminating the paths of those hurrying about their day. Inside the audition hall, Lena sat poised, ready to continue her journey. She had faced judgment, mockery, and doubt, and yet here she was composed, determined, and more alive than ever. This was only the first step, but it was a powerful one. Lena had arrived, and the world was beginning to notice. Lena left the stage after her first piece, her heart still racing, but a strange calm settled over her. The applause had been unexpected, but quiet enough not to feel overwhelming. She carefully collected her music folder and returned to her corner, sitting down as other contestants prepared for their turns. The room had changed subtly. The mocking whispers she had heard earlier were gone, replaced by a tense curiosity. People glanced at her now, some hesitant, some wide-eyed. It was as if her presence alone had shifted the energy of the hall, though Lena remained focused on herself, not them. She could still feel the pulse of the music vibrating through her fingers and chest. That first piece, the one she had poured her heart into, had left something lingering in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of her skill. She had played not to impress, not to prove a point, but because it was the truest expression of who she was. That honesty had a weight no amount of mocking could erase. Lena closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound fade completely from her mind, grounding herself for what was next. Around her, the other contestants were preparing for their pieces. Some were practicing scales, others discussing strategy in hushed tones. Lena noticed one young man carefully adjusting his posture, as though he were rehearsing his confidence. Another girl whispered to a friend, glancing toward Lena, and the look on her face was a mixture of disbelief and annoyance. She seemed unaccustomed to the idea that someone so simple, so plain in appearance, could hold such power in her music. Lena felt a small, quiet smile tug at her lips. She didn't need to interact with them. Her music spoke louder than their words ever could. As the judges called the next auditionee, Lena allowed herself a moment to reflect on her journey. She remembered the countless evenings spent at her small keyboard at home, practicing in silence so her neighbors would not complain about the noise. She thought of the early mornings when she would rise before dawn, squeezing in time with her music before heading to her day job. She remembered the times she had cried over mistakes, the frustration of not being able to play a piece perfectly, and the slow, steady joy of finally mastering one section after another. Those memories gave her strength, a reminder that she had earned every note she played today. The girl who had whispered about Lena earlier went next. Lena watched quietly as the performance began. It was technically skilled, fast, and precise, but it lacked the depth she felt so strongly in her own music. The judges nodded politely at the end, but there was no quiet ripple of surprise or emotion that had followed Lena's first piece. The difference was subtle, but Lena noticed. Music was more than notes. It was emotion, feeling, and truth, and that was something she carried inside her. When the next contestant was called, Lena felt a twinge of nerves. She knew that each performance could change the perception of the judges, and that her earlier success did not guarantee anything. But she reminded herself that she had no choice but to continue being true to her music. There was no room for pretending, no space for insecurity. She took deep, steadying breaths, allowing her mind to clear and focus on the music that waited within her. She imagined the keys beneath her fingers, the vibrations that would resonate through the room, and the story she wanted to tell through sound. A memory drifted into Lena's mind. It was a memory from years ago, when she had first touched a piano as a child. It had been in a small community center, one that was poorly maintained but full of warmth. She remembered the feeling of her fingers on the worn keys, the thrill of discovering that she could make music, the joy of hearing notes come together in harmony. That sense of wonder had never left her, and now, years later, it was the same feeling that carried her forward. She was still that girl, wide-eyed and determined, and nothing could take that away. As she waited, Lena overheard a conversation between two contestants nearby. One of them, speaking softly, but with a clear tone of condescension, said, "I can't believe they let her in. She doesn't even look like someone who could play professionally." The other nodded in agreement, smirking. Lena felt a familiar heat rise in her chest, a mix of irritation and sadness. She did not respond, did not defend herself, because she knew it would do no good. Their words held no power over her, not really. She had already proven to herself that she belonged here, that her music was valid, and that was enough. A staff member approached Lena briefly, checking her audition schedule and confirming her next piece. Lena nodded politely, thanking them, but inside she felt a quiet tension building. This was the moment when doubt often crept in, even for the most prepared. She reminded herself that doubt was natural, but it was not an enemy. It was a companion, one that she had learned to walk with rather than fight. With a final deep breath, she closed her eyes, letting the noise of the hall fade. The whispers, the stares, the judgments, all of it disappeared as she focused inward, drawing strength from the quiet center of her being. The next few auditions passed. Lena watched, listened, and learned. Each performance was unique, and each contestant had their own strengths and weaknesses. Some played with precision, but lacked feeling. Others played with passion, but struggled with technique. Each person, in their own way, revealed something about themselves, and Lena observed quietly, learning not just from her own experience, but from theirs as well. She felt no envy or resentment, only a growing sense of clarity about what music truly meant to her. As the day progressed, the waiting area began to feel smaller, the air heavier with anticipation. Contestants fidgeted, tapped their feet, whispered nervously. Lena remained calm, seated with a straight back, her music folder resting on her lap. Occasionally, she would glance at the judges, noticing subtle reactions, tiny shifts in expression. Even without playing, she could sense the quiet change in their perception. The same people who had looked at her skeptically were now watching her with curiosity, some with respect, though none of it was acknowledged openly. Lena did not need acknowledgement. She could feel the energy shifting, and that was enough. A memory came unbidden of her father watching her practice at home. He had always been her biggest supporter, the one who had believed in her talent when no one else did. He had encouraged her to follow her heart, to play with feeling, to trust herself. Lena smiled faintly at the memory, feeling a warmth that steadied her. She realized that today, in this audition hall, she was not just playing for the judges or the audience. She was playing for him, for the memory of someone who had always seen her potential. Even when the world did not as the afternoon sun shifted through the tall windows, casting long beams of light across the polished floors, Lena felt a renewed sense of focus. She could hear the faint hum of the heater, the distant traffic, the occasional cough or shuffle of feet, but all of it faded into the background as she centered herself. She placed her hands lightly on her music folder, feeling the familiar texture of the pages. This was her anchor, a reminder of the countless hours she had spent preparing, the sacrifices she had made, and the unwavering belief she carried in her heart. When her turn came again, Lena walked to the piano with the same quiet determination as before. Her movements were deliberate, measured, calm. She adjusted the bench, positioned her music folder on the stand, and took a deep breath. The judges looked up, a mixture of curiosity and anticipation on their faces. She felt the weight of their gaze, but did not let it distract her. Her focus was on the music, on the story she wanted to tell, on the emotion she wanted to convey. The first notes were soft, deliberate, and full of feeling. Lena let the music flow naturally, each phrase emerging from her heart. She played not for the applause, not for the recognition, but for the pure joy of creating something beautiful. The room grew silent, the usual murmurs and whispers fading completely as her music filled the space. Judges leaned forward slightly, their expressions showing surprise, admiration, and in some cases, disbelief. Contestants who had mocked her earlier shifted uncomfortably, some glancing away, others frozen in place, unable to hide their astonishment as Lena continued. She felt a deep connection to the piano and the music. Each chord resonated not just through the hall, but through her own being, a reminder of all the struggles and triumphs that had led her to this moment. She remembered the long nights of practice, the quiet mornings before work, the sacrifices she had made, and the belief her father had instilled in her. All of it came together in the music, creating something honest, raw, and unforgettable. By the time she finished, the room was utterly still. The judges exchanged glances, the air heavy with unspoken recognition. Lena closed her music folder gently, rising from the bench with quiet composure. She felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration, a sense of having given everything she had. As she stepped back into the waiting area, she noticed a subtle change in the way people looked at her. The mocking expressions were gone, replaced by curiosity, respect, and, in some cases, admiration. She did not let it affect her, but it was impossible not to notice. Sitting down again, Lena allowed herself a moment to breathe. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the years of quiet practice, the moments of doubt, and the moments of triumph. She realized that today was not just about an audition. It was about proving to herself that Lena sat in the waiting area, her hands folded neatly in her lap, feeling a quiet calm settle over her. The hall had grown warmer with the afternoon sun, casting long streaks of light across the polished floors. The other contestants whispered among themselves, some practicing silently, others adjusting their posture or their music sheets. Lena noticed the subtle change in the air around her. The laughter and mocking glances from earlier in the day had disappeared, replaced by a tense curiosity. People were watching her now, but she remained focused on herself, letting their attention pass over her without impact. A young man sitting across the room kept glancing at her, his expression one of disbelief. He was well-dressed, confident, and clearly used to being the center of attention. He had mocked her quietly earlier, whispering to his friend about how that simple lady had no chance of impressing anyone. Now, after hearing her first performance, he seemed uncertain. His eyes flicked to her fingers, imagining how they had moved across the keys, then quickly looked away, as if afraid of admitting he had been wrong. Lena noticed him, but did not respond. She had no need to argue or explain. Her music had already spoken. The judges called the next contestant, and Lena watched as a young woman stepped onto the stage. She was elegant and poised, her posture perfect, her confidence evident. The piece she played was technically flawless, her fingers moving quickly and accurately across the keys. Yet, there was something missing. Lena could feel it from where she sat. The music was precise, but lacked soul. It was as if the notes were only being played to impress, rather than to express. Lena smiled faintly. She understood that skill alone was not enough. True music came from the heart. During the short pause between performances, Lena allowed her mind to drift for a moment. She remembered her early days at home, playing on a small, slightly out-of-tune keyboard she had saved up to buy. She had practiced tirelessly in the evenings, after long hours at work, often exhausted and frustrated. There had been times when she wanted to give up, when the mistakes seemed too many and the progress too slow. But she had continued, because the music was a part of her, something she could not ignore. Each note she played now carried those years of quiet effort, that dedication that no one had seen. As she reflected, a few contestants nearby exchanged low whispers. One said, "I still can't believe she plays like that. Where did she learn?" The other shrugged, looking uncertain. Lena overheard them, but she did not react. Their words no longer carried the sting they might have once. She had spent too many years facing doubt and skepticism to be shaken by it now. Instead, she let the silence and focus of the waiting area settle around her. Preparing herself for the next round, her mind wandered briefly to her father. He had been the one who had first recognized her talent. He had encouraged her to keep playing, to pursue her dreams quietly, but with determination. Lena remembered the nights he had sat beside her at the old keyboard, nodding and smiling, praising her small victories and comforting her during failures. Those memories brought a warmth that steadied her nerves. Today, in this grand audition hall, she carried that encouragement with her. Invisible but powerful, the next name was called, and Lena watched as a tall, confident man approached the stage. He seemed certain of himself, moving with practiced ease. He played a complex piece, full of rapid scales and intricate rhythms. The judges nodded politely, impressed by the technical skill, but again, there was no depth, no emotion that lingered in the room afterward. Lena thought about the difference between playing for others and playing for oneself. Skill could be taught, technique could be learned, but the honesty and emotion that resonated from within a person could not. She had that. She knew it. When the judges finally called Lena's name again, a ripple of attention moved through the room. Some contestants looked uncomfortable, others curious. The same young man who had doubted her earlier shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact but clearly aware of her presence. Lena stood calmly, holding her music folder close. Each step toward the piano was measured, deliberate, filled with quiet confidence. She adjusted the bench, opened her folder, and took a deep, grounding breath. This moment was hers. The world's opinions, the doubts, the expectations, they all faded as she focused inward. Her fingers hovered above the keys, waiting for the perfect moment to begin. Lena closed her eyes briefly, feeling the memory of her father's encouragement. The years of practice and the joy of creating music fill her heart. Then, with a gentle touch, she pressed the first note. The sound was soft, warm, and precise. She allowed the music to flow naturally, each phrase building upon the last. It was not a performance meant to impress. It was an expression of everything she had lived through, every struggle, every triumph, every quiet victory. As the first few notes filled the hall, Lena noticed the change in the room. The whispers had stopped completely. Contestants leaned forward, some mouths slightly open, unable to hide their astonishment. Judges sat straighter, their pens paused over notes as they listened intently. There was a tension in the air, a recognition that something extraordinary was unfolding. Lena played with focus and emotion, letting each note tell a story, each pause carry meaning. She was no longer just a contestant. She was a storyteller, and the piano was her voice. The young man across the room shifted uncomfortably. He had expected a timid, awkward performance, the kind that would confirm his assumptions. Instead, he was confronted with skill, emotion, and authenticity. His earlier confidence faltered, replaced by a quiet shock. Lena did not notice him, nor did she need to. Her attention was fully on the music, on the connection she was creating with the room, with herself. And with her father's memory that guided her hands, Lena's second piece was longer and more complex than the first. She had chosen it carefully, knowing it would allow her to showcase not only technical skill, but also depth of emotion. Each chord resonated with a clarity that made the hall seem alive. Judges leaned forward, some nodding slightly, others closing their eyes as if to absorb every nuance. The other contestants who had once mocked her sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the transformation they were witnessing. The simple lady they had dismissed was no longer simple. She was extraordinary. Memories of her practice sessions at home surfaced again. She remembered the countless hours spent perfecting this merry piece, her fingers moving slowly at first, learning every note with patience, correcting every mistake. She remembered the moments of frustration when her fingers refused to cooperate, and the moments of triumph when a difficult passage finally came together. Every memory, every effort, every sacrifice was alive in the music now. It was a culmination of years of dedication, and the audience could feel it. As she reached the middle section, Lena allowed herself to feel the emotion fully. She played with passion and precision, the notes rising and falling like waves, carrying the story of her journey. The room was silent, but the energy was palpable. The judges were no longer merely evaluating. They were experiencing. The other contestants were frozen, some leaning forward, others clasping their hands, all mesmerized by the unexpected power and depth in her performance. Lena felt no need to look up or gauge their reactions. The music was enough. The final notes approached, softening and slowing, carrying a sense of closure and resolution. Lena's hands moved with effortless grace, her fingers pressing each key with intention and care. When the last note lingered in the air, a profound silence followed. The room seemed suspended in time, the only sound the faint rustle of papers and the quiet exhale of someone sitting nearby. Lena closed her folder gently, her hands resting in her lap. She rose from the bench, her posture calm, her heart full. She had given everything, and the truth of her music had been heard. The judges whispered among themselves, their expressions a mixture of surprise, admiration, and contemplation. Lena walked back to her seat, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The mocking glances and skeptical stares were gone. In their place was a newfound respect, subtle but undeniable. Contestants who had doubted her shifted nervously, some avoiding her gaze, others stealing quick, hesitant looks. Lena did not need to acknowledge them. She had already claimed her space through honesty, skill, and emotion. Sitting down, Lena allowed herself a moment to breathe. The warmth of the afternoon sun, the polished floor beneath her feet, the faint hum of activity around her, all of it seemed distant compared to the clarity and peace she felt within. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the struggles and triumphs, the countless hours of practice, and the unwavering support of her father's memory. She realized that this audition was not just a test of skill. It was a test of her resilience, her dedication, and her belief in herself. During the brief pause, Lena overheard a conversation nearby. One contestant said, She's amazing. I can't believe how well she plays." Another nodded, almost whispering, "I didn't expect that at all. She's on a different level." Lena's lips curved into a faint smile. It was not the recognition that mattered. It was the confirmation that the truth of her music had reached others. For years, she had played in private, uncertain if anyone could truly understand or appreciate the depth of her expression. Now, in this grand hall, that truth was earned. Lena walked back to her corner after her last performance, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Her hands were slightly sore from the intensity of her playing, yet her heart felt light, full of a strange joy she could barely describe. The energy in the room had shifted completely. The mocking glances from earlier in the day had vanished, replaced by a quiet curiosity and cautious admiration. Contestants who had once whispered about her now sat rigidly, their expressions a mix of disbelief and awe. Lena noticed it, but she did not allow herself to dwell on it. She had come here to play music, not to receive approval, and that focus had carried her through everything. The hall was buzzing quietly as other contestants went on stage. Some were technical, some were emotional, but none had captured the raw honesty that Lena had brought to her performance. A few judges whispered among themselves. Their pens paused as they listened and evaluated. Lena could feel their attention, yet it felt different from before. It was no longer skepticism. It was genuine interest, a recognition of something rare and authentic. The young man who had doubted her earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had expected a timid, awkward performance, and instead, he was confronted with skill, emotion, and authenticity. Lena took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment as she remembered the countless hours she had spent at home, practicing late into the night. She remembered the small keyboard she had bought with her own savings, the old, worn keys that never seemed to stay in tune. She remembered her father watching her practice, his quiet encouragement and pride filling the room, even when he wasn't there physically. Every mistake, every triumph, every moment of doubt had led her here. And now she could feel the culmination of all those years flowing through her fingertips. As she waited for her next turn, Lena noticed a young girl sitting nearby, nervously adjusting her sheet music. She looked familiar with the atmosphere of the hall, but clearly intimidated by the judges and the audience. Lena offered her a small, reassuring smile, and the girl's eyes brightened slightly. It was a silent acknowledgement, a small act of empathy in the midst of a tense environment. Lena had learned over the years that music was not just about competition. It was about connection, about sharing something deeply personal with others. Even small gestures mattered, and she felt a quiet satisfaction in offering one. The next contestant took the stage, a tall young man whose performance was filled with speed and precision. He played complex arpeggios and rapid scales, each note hitting the keys with exacting accuracy. Yet, despite his technical skill, Lena could sense the lack of emotional depth. The judges nodded politely at the end, but the room did not feel moved. Lena realized that many in the hall were beginning to understand something she had known all along. Music without feeling was merely noise, impressive on the surface, but empty beneath. When her name was called again, Lena rose quietly, holding her music folder close. Her movements were deliberate, calm, and steady. The other contestants looked at her with curiosity, some with subtle awe. She walked to the grand piano, adjusted the bench carefully, and positioned her music folder on the stand. Taking a deep breath, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the moment. This was more than an audition now. It was a chance to show what music could do when it came from the heart. Her fingers hovered above the keys for a moment, and then, with a gentle touch, she began to play. The first notes were soft, deliberate, and filled with warmth. The hall seemed to hold its breath as her music spread through the air. Lena allowed each phrase to flow naturally, each chord carrying the weight of her journey, her struggles, and her triumphs. She was not playing for applause or recognition. She was playing to tell a story, one that had been building quietly for years in the privacy of her apartment. In the quiet evenings spent at her small keyboard as the music continued, Lena noticed the room transforming around her. The energy shifted from curiosity to awe, from skepticism to admiration. The judges leaned forward, their expressions softening as they listened intently. The other contestants who had once whispered and laughed now sat frozen, their faces showing a mix of shock and disbelief. The young man who had doubted her earlier avoided her gaze, clearly stunned by the depth and power of her performance. Lena ignored all of it. Her focus was entirely on the music, on the story she wanted to tell, on the emotions she wanted to convey. With each passing note, Lena felt more connected to the piano and the hall itself. She imagined her father sitting beside her, smiling proudly, encouraging her to let the music flow freely. She remembered the years of practice, the frustration of mistakes, the triumph of finally mastering difficult passages. All of it converged in the performance now, creating something authentic, raw, and moving. Her music carried a story of perseverance, of quiet dedication, of love for an art form that had shaped her life. The middle section of her piece was filled with emotion. Lena allowed herself to feel deeply, letting every note reflect a moment of her life, the loneliness of practice, the joy of discovery, the sorrow of loss, the triumph of small victories. The hall seemed to respond, the air vibrating with the resonance of her playing. The judges were silent, listening with rapt attention. Contestants who had mocked her earlier were frozen, unable to comprehend the skill and emotion emanating from someone they had dismissed. For the first time, Lena felt that she was not just performing. She was touching hearts. Time seemed to stretch and fold around her as she played. Every note was deliberate, every pause intentional. She let her fingers move freely, guided by memory, feeling, and intuition rather than strict technique alone. The music was alive, telling a story without words. She could feel the emotions of the room shifting, the subtle energy of admiration and surprise settling in. The experience was both exhausting and exhilarating. Lena felt a deep, quiet joy that came from knowing she had given everything she had got as the final notes approached. Lena's hands moved with grace and precision. She allowed the music to soften, each chord lingering in the air longer than expected. There was a sense of closure and resolution in her performance, a quiet echo of all she had experienced in her life. When the last note faded, the hall remained silent for a moment, as if absorbing everything that had just been expressed. Then, slowly, a soft murmur of astonishment spread through the audience. The judges sat back, exchanging glances that conveyed both admiration and surprise. Lena had captivated them fully. She rose from the bench quietly, her posture calm and composed. Her heart was full, yet she felt a strange lightness, a sense of having released something deeply personal into the world. She returned to her seat, her hands folded neatly on her lap, allowing herself a brief moment to breathe. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. The mocking whispers and skeptical glances of the morning were gone. In their place was a quiet respect, a recognition that talent, dedication, and authenticity could never be underestimated. Contestants, who had once whispered and laughed, now looked at her with hesitation and admiration. Some avoided eye contact, clearly unsure of how to respond. A few exchanged awkward whispers, as if trying to reconcile what they had expected with what they had just witnessed. Lena did not need to acknowledge them. She had already made her mark. Her music had spoken louder than words ever could. She had proven something far more meaningful than technical skill. It was the power of emotion. Heart and perseverance. During the short break that followed, Lena reflected quietly on her journey. She remembered the small apartment where she had practiced, the worn keyboard that had been her constant companion, and the countless hours spent mastering difficult pieces. She thought of her father, who had always believed in her talent, who had encouraged her even when others had doubted. The memory filled her with warmth and quiet pride. She realized that this audition was no longer about competition. It was about sharing her story, her dedication, and her love for music with the world. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow across the polished floors. Lena sat quietly, feeling the warmth on her skin, the faint hum of activity around her, and the energy of the room. She understood that her performance had changed the atmosphere, had shifted the perceptions of those around her. She felt a quiet satisfaction, not from recognition or applause, but from the knowledge that she had expressed her truth fully and honestly. That was what mattered most. As the next round of auditions began, Lena listened quietly, observing the other contestants. Their performances were impressive in skill, but she could sense the difference between technical ability and true expression. Some played with precision but lacked feeling. Others played with emotion but struggled with technique. Lena understood that her journey had taught her both technical skill, honed through persistent practice, and emotional depth born from life experience. That combination was rare, and she carried it with quiet pride. Finally, the judges announced a brief intermission. Lena used the time to stretch her fingers and relax her shoulders. She reflected on the day, the progression of performances, and the reactions of those around her. She had faced doubt, skepticism, and quiet mockery, yet she had emerged with her dignity intact, her music heard, and her spirit unbroken. The experience had been. Lena returned to her seat, her hands resting lightly on her lap, as the hall hummed with a strange mixture of silence and tension. She felt a calm settle over her, though her heart still carried the rhythm of the last piece she had played. The atmosphere had changed entirely. Contestants who had once whispered cruel remarks now sat rigid, some staring at the piano as if it were a sacred object. Their confidence had faltered, replaced by awe and a subtle fear of underestimating someone again. Lena noticed this quietly, but she did not allow herself to become distracted. She had learned long ago that the opinions of others could not guide her. Her music was her own, and it had already spoken volumes. The judges whispered among themselves, occasionally exchanging glances, their expressions a mixture of admiration, surprise, and deep contemplation. Lena could sense their evaluation shifting, not just focusing on technical skill, but on the authenticity and depth of her playing. For years, she had honed both aspects, often in isolation, uncertain whether anyone would ever recognize her effort or care about the honesty of her expression. Now, in this grand hall, she felt the recognition subtly taking shape, though she reminded herself that approval was not the goal. She played for music, for emotion, and for the memory of her father, who had always believed in her potential when no one else did. Around her, the other contestants had become unusually quiet. The young man who had doubted her earliest now shifted in his seat repeatedly, unable to hide his astonishment. Earlier, he had expected a timid, unremarkable performance. Instead, Lena had poured heart, soul, and years of quiet practice into a display of power and emotion that none of them could ignore. He glanced at the judges and back at her, a conflicted look on his face. Some of the other contestants avoided eye contact entirely, clearly aware of how their initial judgments had been completely wrong. Lena felt a mixture of sympathy and quiet pride, but she did not react outwardly. She knew that her music had spoken louder than words ever could. The room had grown unusually still, the kind of silence that feels almost heavy because it carries unspoken recognition. Lena took the time to steady herself for the next performance. Her hands hovered lightly over her music folder, and she closed her eyes for a brief moment. She allowed herself to recall the quiet evenings at home, when the apartment was dark, except for a single lamp, and she had practiced until her fingers ached. She remembered the tiny keyboard she had saved up for, the warm keys that never seemed to stay perfectly in tune, and the countless mistakes she had corrected patiently. All of those moments had led her to this very place, and she felt their presence now as a subtle but firm source of strength. As the next contestant went on stage, Lena observed silently. The piece was complex, fast, and precise, but it lacked the emotional resonance she had cultivated in her own music. She could see the judges nodding politely at the technical skill, but there was no spark of wonder or emotion. Lena realized that most people focus only on speed and accuracy, yet it was not enough. Music, she had learned, was not merely the perfection of notes, it was the communication of feeling, the telling of a story, the evocation of something beyond words. That lesson had been her guiding force, and today it had set her apart. Her own next turn came quickly. Lena stood, her movements quiet and controlled. The room's energy was taut, full of anticipation and the weight of curiosity. Contestants who had laughed at her earlier shifted uncomfortably, while others looked on with a mixture of hesitation and admiration. Lena held her music folder gently, walking to the piano with calm determination. She adjusted the bench, opened her folder, and placed her hands lightly on the keys. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, allowing herself to feel every memory, every sacrifice, every note she had ever learned. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft, deliberate, and full of life. The room seemed to hold its breath, listening intently as her fingers moved over the keys with precision and grace. Lena allowed each phrase to flow naturally, drawing from the years of quiet practice and the emotions she had carried in her heart. She played not to impress, not to prove herself, but to tell a story that only she could fully understand, and yet that everyone in the room could feel. The atmosphere transformed instantly. Curiosity and skepticism were replaced by awe and a profound stillness as the music deepened. Lena felt a wave of emotion rise within her. She poured her feelings into each note, letting the piano become an extension of herself. Every chord, every pause, every subtle shift in tempo carried meaning. The judges leaned forward, silent but clearly moved by the depth of expression. The other contestants who had once doubted her now sat frozen, their faces pale and tense. They had expected a simple performance, one they could dismiss easily. Instead, they were confronted with raw talent, honesty, and an emotion so powerful it seemed to fill every corner of the room. Lena's middle section swelled with intensity, the notes rising and falling like waves, carrying the story of her journey, the countless hours of practice, the frustration of mistakes, the quiet triumphs, and the unwavering belief in herself. She imagined her father sitting beside her, smiling and nodding, reminding her to trust in the music and in herself. That memory strengthened her resolve, allowing her to play with even greater depth and clarity. She could feel the subtle shifts in the room, judges leaning forward, contestants holding their breath, and an almost tangible electricity in the air. For the first time in the audition, Lena noticed something remarkable. The young man who had mocked her earlier seemed frozen, unable to look away. His eyes were wide, reflecting disbelief and perhaps a dawning respect. Other contestants shifted nervously, some glancing at each other for reassurance, others gripping their music sheets tightly. Lena did not let herself be distracted. Her focus was entirely on the piano, on the story she wanted to tell, and on the emotions that had been building within her for years. The final section of the piece approached, softening yet filled with a profound resonance. Lena allowed the notes to linger, each one carrying a sense of closure and completion. She played with both precision and emotion, her hands moving effortlessly, yet every chord held intention and heart. The hall seemed to respond to her music, the energy vibrating subtly through the polished floor and the air itself. Judges were silent, captivated, while the other contestants remained still, unable to deny the power and truth in her performance. When the last note faded, a heavy silence lingered for a moment, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Then, slowly, a wave of realization swept across the hall. The judges exchanged glances, a mixture of astonishment and admiration on their faces. The contestants who had doubted her earlier were frozen, some mouths slightly open, some avoiding eye contact entirely. Lena rose gently from the bench, her posture calm, her heart full. She returned to her seat, quietly acknowledging the subtle applause that began to build from the back of the room. It was not loud or overwhelming, but it carried a profound respect that words could not convey. Sitting down, Lena reflected on what had just happened. She had come here, knowing she would face doubt and ridicule, Yet she had remained true to herself. She had played with honesty, emotion, and skill, and in doing so, she had changed the way the room perceived her. The mockery and whispers of earlier had vanished completely. In their place was something far more meaningful: recognition of talent, admiration for dedication, and an understanding that appearances could be deceiving. The young man who had doubted her finally looked at her, his expression one of awkward acknowledgment. He muttered something under his breath, clearly unsure how to respond. Lena did not react outwardly. She did not need to. Her music had already spoken for her, and that was enough. Around her, contestants whispered quietly among themselves, some offering hesitant compliments, others merely shaking their heads in disbelief. Lena's presence had shifted the energy of the entire audition. The judges called a brief intermission, and Lena used the time to stretch her fingers and relax her shoulders. She reflected on her journey, the early mornings and late nights, the small apartment where she had practiced alone, and the unwavering belief her father had instilled in her. That belief had carried her through every moment of doubt and every obstacle she had faced. She realized now that it was not just her skill or emotion that had captivated the room. It was her dedication, her perseverance, and her authenticity. Those qualities could never be taught, and they shone through in every note she had played. As the intermission ended and contestants prepared for the next round, Lena sat quietly, her mind clear and focused. She had proven, not just to others but to herself, that she belonged here. She understood that the remaining performances would be judged on skill and interpretation, but she also knew that she had made an impression that would not be forgotten. Her music had reached beyond technique. It had touched hearts, shifted perceptions, and commanded respect. When her name was called again, Lena rose, holding her music folder with calm determination. She walked to the piano, adjusted the bench, and allowed her hands to rest on the keys. The judges watched intently. Contestants looked on with quiet astonishment, and the hall seemed to lean forward in anticipation. Lena took a deep breath, feeling the memory of her faith. The final round of auditions was underway, and Lena felt a quiet focus settling over her. The air in the hall was thick with anticipation. Contestants who had once whispered and laughed now watched silently, their expressions tense, some almost fearful of what they might witness next. Lena did not pay attention to them. She had learned long ago that the only thing that mattered was the music, the story she wanted to tell, and the honesty she carried within herself. Every step she had taken, every hour she had spent practicing, every quiet moment of doubt and triumph, had led to this point. The judges were clearly attentive, their eyes following every move, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and deep consideration. They had seen many talented performers, but there was something about Lena's presence, something subtle yet undeniable, that had shifted the energy in the room. Her music did not just demonstrate skill, it revealed the heart behind the hands. It was personal, intimate, and full of life. Lena could feel their attention, but it did not intimidate her. She welcomed it quietly, knowing that she had earned the right to be here. When her name was finally called, Lena rose slowly, her posture calm and deliberate. The other contestants looked at her with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The young man who had mocked her early in the day avoided eye contact entirely, shifting in his seat uncomfortably. He had expected an ordinary performance, something he could dismiss easily, and instead he had been confronted with the depth of her talent and the honesty of her expression. Lena walked to the piano with steady steps, her music folder held gently in her hands. She adjusted the bench, opened her folder, and placed her hands lightly on the keys. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself to feel the culmination of everything she had lived through years of practice. Moments of doubt, the quiet encouragement of her father, and the countless sacrifices that had brought her here. Then, With a deep breath, she began to play. The first notes were soft, warm, and deliberate. The hall fell silent, every sound fading into the background, except for the music flowing from her fingertips. Lena let the notes tell the story she had carried inside her for years. A story of perseverance, dedication, and quiet passion. As she moved through the first part of the piece, Lena could feel the energy in the room shift. The judges leaned forward, silent and attentive, taking in every nuance of her performance. Contestants who had doubted her earlier now sat frozen, their expressions ranging from disbelief to awe. The young man who had mocked her earlier shifted nervously, clearly struggling to reconcile his previous assumptions with the reality in front of him. Lena did not allow herself to be distracted. She focused entirely on the music, allowing it to flow naturally, each note a reflection of her heart and experiences. The middle section of her performance was filled with emotion and intensity. Lena allowed herself to feel deeply, letting every note carry meaning and every pause speak volumes. She remembered the countless hours she had spent practicing alone, the frustration of mistakes, the triumph of finally mastering difficult passages, and the quiet moments when she had doubted herself. All of that energy was now flowing through the piano, creating something raw, authentic, and unforgettable. The hall seemed to vibrate with the resonance of her music, and Lena felt a deep connection to both the instrument and the space around her. She imagined her father sitting beside her, nodding encouragingly, reminding her to trust in the music and in herself. That memory strengthened her, allowing her to play with even greater confidence and clarity. Lena's hands moved effortlessly across the keys, her fingers guided by both skill and emotion. Each chord, each arpeggio, each subtle shift in tempo carried meaning beyond the notes themselves. Her music was alive, telling a story that everyone in the room could feel, even if they could not fully understand it. By the time she reached the final section, the room was utterly still. The judges were completely absorbed, their pens paused, their expressions showing both admiration and surprise. The contestants who had doubted her earlier were frozen, some clasping their hands tightly, others leaning forward, eyes wide in shock. Lena played with grace, precision, and emotional depth, allowing the notes to linger in the air. Every movement of her fingers, every chord, every pause reflected not just her skill, but her years of dedication, perseverance, and unwavering belief in herself. When the last note faded, a profound silence filled the hall. The energy was heavy, almost sacred, as if everyone were holding their breath, absorbing the impact of her performance. Then, slowly, the judges began to exchange glances, nodding subtly, their expressions softening. The other contestants, who had doubted her from the start, were still frozen, some unable to speak, others simply shaking their heads in disbelief. Lena sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her heart full but calm. She knew that she had shared the truth of her music, and that was all that mattered. The hall began to stir with quiet applause, soft at first, but gradually growing louder as people acknowledged the beauty and power of her performance. Lena did not rise or bow immediately. She allowed the moment to exist fully, letting the music and emotion linger even after the notes had ended. The applause continued, more genuine and heartfelt than anything she had ever received. It was not simply for technical skill. It was for honesty, for heart, for a talent that had been cultivated with dedication and perseverance. One of the judges finally stood and approached the stage, applauding quietly but with evident respect. Lena looked up briefly, meeting their eyes, and felt a sense of validation that went far beyond recognition. She had come here with no illusions, prepared to face doubt and skepticism, yet she had managed to touch the hearts of those in the room. Her journey, her practice, her dedication, and her honesty had all been acknowledged in the most subtle yet meaningful way. The young man who had doubted her earlier finally spoke, his voice low and uncertain. I didn't expect that," he said quietly to a friend nearby. He glanced at Lena again, and there was an unmistakable mixture of respect and embarrassment in his expression. Lena offered no response, no words. She did not need to. Her music had already spoken for her. Around her, the other contestants whispered quietly among themselves, some offering tentative compliments, others simply shaking their heads in disbelief. The room had shifted completely, and Lena had done nothing more than be herself and play from her heart. During the final moments of the audition, the judges deliberated quietly. Lena remained seated, her mind calm and reflective. She thought about her journey, the long hours of practice, the small apartment where she had worked tirelessly, the sacrifices she had made, and the quiet encouragement of her father. She realized that this moment was not just about winning or recognition. It was about proving to herself that persistence, passion, and honesty could overcome doubt, mockery, and underestimation. That realization filled her with a quiet pride and contentment that no applause could match. When the judges finally called all the contestants to gather in the front of the hall, Lena stood calmly, her posture straight and composed. She noticed the expressions of the other contestants, some still stunned, others quietly impressed, and a few more aware of their own assumptions that had been completely wrong. Lena did not react to any of it. She had achieved something far more significant than approval or admiration. She had demonstrated the power of dedication, the value of honesty, and the impact of music played from the heart. The head judge stepped forward and addressed the contestants. "Today, we witnessed performances of great skill," they began, their voice calm and deliberate. But one performer stood out not only for technical ability, but for the honesty, emotion, and dedication they brought to the music. That performer demonstrated that talent is not simply about speed or precision, but about heart, persistence, and the courage to be oneself. Lena listened quietly, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She had not sought attention or praise, yet her efforts had been recognized in the most meaningful way. The judge continued, calling Lena's name as the one whose performance had truly moved them. A ripple of acknowledgement and quiet admiration passed through the room. Contestants who had doubted her earlier looked on, some unsure whether to congratulate her, others simply stunned. Lena stepped forward, her movements calm and measured. She approached the judges with quiet confidence, accepting their acknowledgement without fanfare. The validation was not just for her skill, but for everything she had put into her music, the years of practice, the sacrifices, the dedication, and the unwavering belief in herself. As the final moments of the audition concluded, Lena looked around the room. The atmosphere had transformed completely. The whispers, the mockery, and the skepticism had been replaced by respect, admiration, and recognition of the truth of her talent. Contestants approached her quietly, offering congratulations, hesitant yet sincere. Lena accepted them with polite smiles, her heart full. She did not need to boast or demand acknowledgement. Her music had already spoken, and that was enough. Walking out of the hall at the end of the day, Lena felt a quiet satisfaction settle over her. The sun was setting, casting long golden rays across the pavement outside. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day and the culmination of her efforts. She